A very warm good evening to you all, and welcome to the rendezvous post-COVID vaccine hybrid meeting of the Cardiological Society of India Kerala chapter. We all know that we had a very turbulent, we were going through a very turbulent period. We had our own hardships over the past 1 year, and we were sailing through troubled waters. And of course, that's what ships are meant for. And ships are not meant to be tied to the shore. And now we hope that we are slowly recovering from that phase. And that's why we have rightly kept the name, the rendezvous, that is the reunion of our own friends after a long gap. To start the proceedings, I invite Dr. Zulfikar Ahmed, the Scientific Committee Chairman of Cardiological Society of India Kerala Chapter.
Thank you. Without any preface, I think we will start the scientific program because of, right? I think we will. Who will invite? You will invite Deepak. Okay.
We will start with the first session, and we have aptly titled it as Straight from the Mastros. There are 2 talks in this session. To chair this session, we have Dr. Giva Zakaria, Dr. Praveen G. Pai, Dr. Ullas. Over to the chairpersons.
I think we will not waste time. We'll start straight away, go to the talks. I think the first talk is by Deepak Davison, My Interventional Cardiology Practice in 2020. Lessons learned. We'll have discussion at the end of the 2 talks. Deepak, you can start.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir. Good evening to all of you. I hope I'm audible. Good evening to all of you. First of all, let me thank the organizers, especially Joni sir, Dr. Anil, Zulfikar sir, and Dr. Karunadas for having given me this opportunity. I'm extremely happy to be here today evening after a very long time of insight meetings. We were going through difficulties. We were going through webinars. Now it's chance to restart all our reunion. Extremely happy to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity given. Well, now on November 17, the first COVID case was confirmed in China. Following another 2.5 months, we had a first case being confirmed in Kerala. And now as for most of the cardiologists in Kerala, we too had a decent first quarter of 2020. We had our shares of primary angioplasty, complex coronary intervention, and when IVL was launched in India, we had an opportunity to use this particular device very early during the course of this particular usage. Now we started this basically history of a 74-year-old gentleman who was in maintenance hemodialysis, had recurrent angina, hypotension and arrhythmias during the angina. You could see here that there were a lot of arrhythmias. LV was bad. There was moderate mitral regurgitation, was taken up for angiographic evaluation. You could see here that there's a very long lesion in the proximal left anterior descending artery with very heavy calcium in all the vessels. We started with the rotablation even though the patient was very sick. Rotablation also was difficult, 1.5 millimeter burr, and following that we were not able to dilate with the balloon, so we did an OCT evaluation to see the amount of calcium there. You could see in the second image that there is around 270-degree arc of calcification, and the thickness of calcification was almost 1 millimeter. So we decided that we'll go with an intravascular lithotripsy balloon. That's 80 pulses of shock wave delivered with the lithotripsy balloon, following which you could see that there is significant amount of cracks in the calcium over here, which can be appreciated at 1 o'clock position. then here at 7 o'clock position as well as 11 o'clock position. So following the balloon dilatation, we deployed a couple of long stents, 48 millimeter stent in the LAD, and we could achieve a reasonably good flow in the vessel. Now this is the follow-up of the patient. You could see here in the second image that the LV function is improved, the MR has disappeared, the ECG is settled down. Unfortunately, this patient died after 8 months following this particular procedure. Till then she did well and she had a sudden cardiac death. Now in March later half, we had the lockdown being declared by the Prime Minister of India. Everyone went through a lot of difficulties all over the world. Everyone in India, everyone went through a lot of difficulties. But then I felt that we as doctors were the only blessed population. We did not go through a lot of challenges. We had all of us had income problems and all, but then it was in fact a good life for most of us. We started seeing these sort of good cues first time in India. People standing. You tend to see social distancing over there. You tend to most of us even though in the second quarter of 2020 we had less of cath work, we had less of admissions in the hospitals, we had to stay back at home. The management wanted you to stay back at home for 15 days in a month. In spite of that, it was a blessing in disguise. You could appreciate the nature's beauty. You could spend more time with your family. I basically bought 2 cycles. We all went for cycling. We could spend more time with the kids playing football in the home. We spent a lot of time with our friends, the Caritas cycling team. We went for long cycling late in the night, 12 o'clock in the night. We went for 100 kilometers travel in the cycle, and I never could expect these sort of things. In the last 20 years in my life, I got time to do all these things and got an even opportunity to make my kids understand the athletic capabilities of mine during this particular period. And we also had an uninvited guest during the lockdown period, which we managed. So ultimately the webinars became the new normal for most of us. And during one of the webinars, Natarajan sir told me that you should anesthetize your dog. It's creating a lot of trouble. So the most underutilized room in my home was the home theater converted into a webinar room, and that was off the camera. That is how it would look like. Technology came to our rescue. We all started using telehealth for managing our patients. And the second quarter, we had a lot of time, we spent more time in the gym. I know that most of our friends also were more health conscious during this period, but then what happened to me was I was more aggressive into this. I developed rhabdomyolysis, I had CPK elevation, I had creatine elevation. Ultimately, I understood that probably one should try to appreciate the age also. And so finally I understood that I am getting older and older. I should be very more understand all these things. So finally I had to wait for another 4 weeks. I had to be away from the workouts, and then creatine, everything settled down, and then restarted. Now what exactly did we miss during this lockdown? It said that the cardiologist community, we are the ones who go for most number of meetings, the congress as well as seminar. Deprivation syndrome, we lost attending all these things, the workshops, the social gathering. We know that in the past we had at least one major meeting in a month, and at the end of the day we all had these sort of banquets, and we were all entertained by people like Venu sir and PP Mohan sir, and we all had a nice time, and we also enjoyed the fellowships. I hope in this particular area, it was very interesting for most of us. We lost the weekend travel to various places, all these so-called educational travel to abroad also, it all came down. So it was difficult for most of us. We all felt the heat of it. And the third quarter, we all started understanding that we are seeing more and more COVID positive patients in our hospital, in the OPD as well as in the ICUs. And we also understood that primary angioplasty in a COVID patient with all these protective gears on, it's not going to be easy for us. That was our second cath lab, wherein we dedicated it for emergency cases. It was always challenging doing a primary angioplasty in an emergency situation with all these protective gears on. You need to shout inside the cath lab so that people cannot hear you when you speak normally, because you have all these head shields and goggles around you. It's all difficult to manage patients inside the cath lab. You have blurring of vision because of fogging of the goggles. You can't see the wires where exactly it's going. Getting the balloon onto the wire was difficult. Stent positioning was difficult. Identifying dissections was difficult. Managing the patients in the peri-procedure COVID ICU was difficult, having echo evaluation was difficult. So it used to be extremely difficult for managing these particular patients in the ICU. So we decided that we'll only take up high-risk patients, but then managing the high-risk patients also was going to be extremely difficult while undergoing primary angioplasty. We also learned that thrombolytics do really work, so we decided that we'll start thrombolizing our patients with acute myocardial infarction. And again, it was a blessing for most of us. We could have good night's sleep, troubling our dear and near ones. And we saw more and more of cardiac ruptures during this time. We had 3 cardiac ruptures during the last 1 year. All the 3 patients presented with late myocardial infarction, late presentation, thrombolized. In spite of that, they had pericardial effusion, cardiogenic shock, were taken to the theater. This particular patient, you could see that there is some anti-wall myocardial infarction. You tend to see hematoma over there. That was the area. It was oozing. This particular patient was managed conservatively and he survived. This was the second patient who had cardiac tamponade, was taken to the theater, and you could see that there is partial rupture of the myocardium. So I learned from this particular case that every time we see a patient with pericardial effusion following myocardial infarction, we ask our friends to see where exactly the rent is there in the myocardium. Many times you do not see any rent over there. It's just the partial rupture of the myocardium that ultimately bleeds into the pericardium, leading on to cardiac tamponade. This was the 3rd patient, a very fortunate patient. You could see here that she had a through and through ventricular rupture. You could see that the blood is spurting out. Fortunately, this particular patient survived and he's doing well. He came for a hernia repair last week. We also had a couple of TAVI in our hospital during this time, and you could see, we were also surprised to see the groin puncture site. It was almost like the puncture site of an angioplasty. The way it was meticulously done by the proctor also, it was really, really interesting. The first patient of ours went home after the 4th day, but then the second patient of ours was a very frail patient with ESRD. He already had a pre-existing left bundle branch block on ECG prior to procedure. Following the procedure, developed complete heart block, required a permanent pacemaker implantation, was on ventilator for many days, developed ventilator-associated pneumonia. At the end of 30 days, we lost this particular patient. Huge income also. They had to shell out a lot of money also for this particular patient. So this whole month was extremely difficult for me to go through. And the message that I learned from this particular case was, it's always good to have a TAVI done in your hospital, but then always try to avoid extremely sick patients, at least for your health's sake. It's better to avoid these sort of cases. We also had live cases during this particular period, and CSI Kerala came out and helped us all. We all got the utility kit. Our patients were also benefited by our CSI. And coming to the last quarter, on 6th of November, I started developing fever. COVID turned out to be RT-PCR turned out to be positive. But I was happy. Initial 2-3 days I was continuously having fever, but then I had voracious appetite, had good food during that particular 3 days, all these prawns and all. However, we also learned that one should not be complacent with all these protective devices. You could see the respirator on the chest, but following me being positive, you could see that the respirator is actually right now on the face of Joni sir. I was happy just with fever for the 3 days, but then at the end of 3rd day, I developed a syncope. I got admitted in the ICU. They made out that there was some ultrasound lung comments which was identified by Joni sir. They did a CT. CT was not looking good. There were patches over there. Fear started creeping in my mind. But I got the best room in the hospital, sky on the top of me. My wife used to come see me. I felt happy for Zuckerberg. We could use the WhatsApp video calling facilities to see my kids. It was difficult. Next 1 week in the hospital, difficult traveling through troubled waters. Every day morning I get up, see my respiratory rate is around 30 per minute. Oxygen saturation was good, but then the respiratory rate is not coming down. It's around 30. Pulmonologist felt that I should be shifted to ICU if it crosses 430, but then there were a lot of encouragements from all our dear and near ones. Every friends, they sent me a lot of encouragement and motivational messages, and having great colleagues in the department, it used to be very good at that point of time. And I received a lot of help and support from the most unexpected persons, especially from my family, from my CSI, ICC and ICC, Indian College of Cardiology colleagues. I received a lot of motivational and encouragement words and even phone calls. So that was a major thing. At the end of 1 day, by God's grace and prayers from you all, I was discharged and reached back home. And this was the message that Joni sir had WhatsApped me when I got discharged from the hospital. Enjoy your convalescence gracefully, get pampered by your wife deservingly. I enjoyed the next 2 weeks at home, had a lot of food, watched a lot of movies, and even participated in the Cardiology Society meeting. 21st, first quarter, we were happy. We all went for the COVID vaccination. It gave us new ray of hope. We started off with the workshops. We started off with the COVID duties. I was happy to do COVID duties because I could try all these things what I learned during my period of COVID life. And we started off with all these masks and seminars, and back to health, back to good health by God's grace. And ultimately it was a perfect storm. 2020 was a perfect storm for me. I had rhabdomyolysis, I had a COVID infection, but at the end of the day it was a happy story, unlike the movie. So once again, I would like to thank each and everyone who prayed for me. I would also like to thank Joni sir and Dr. Anil for having me this opportunity today. Thank you so much.
Thanks Deepak for that wonderful presentation of whatever you went through during that last COVID. Most of us must have had almost the same experience, even though to such an may not be to such an extent. But why did you have prawns after getting COVID? You told you had prawns after getting COVID.
No. I had rhabdomyolysis.
No. After you ate.
No. I ate a lot of food.
Then you should
My
have told.
appetite was voracious.
Okay. No, I thought prawns are important for COVID. Don't give that message. Sir, any discussion now?
But wonderful. I mean that experience you shared. I was expecting a more discussion on complex cases. And this is a complexity of COVID, and I think you're taken care of, good care about how you presented your experience, the hardships you went through. Really, now only I realize the impact that COVID had on your health and your attitude. How does it change the way you think, because you went through a very difficult time in your life? Because initially you were exercising and then you had rhabdomyolysis, but after that you never expected to get COVID, isn't it?
True, sir.
But when you got COVID and then you had the respiratory rate, now it is very difficult for a physician when he is finding it. For a ordinary patient, it is slightly easier. Now we know everything. So we look at the CT and we look at the deposits, I look at the infiltrates, look at the respiratory rate. And it's very hard for a physician to tackle a disease, isn't it? How do you feel? How do you do? Yeah.
True, sir.
I still remember the day when I was doing a stress test routine. I never had any symptoms. And then ECG showing frank ST depression. That's way back in 2000. And then I realized that I am having a significant disease. So that revelation is a very, very, I don't know how to call this, but I think you must have gone through the same thing.
Yes, sir. In fact, I definitely felt that at some point of time I'll turn out to be positive, because seeing so many patients without taking too much of precautions, I felt that I'll definitely have at some point of time I'll turn out to be positive. But I felt that it's going to be a very simple thing. Initial 2-3 days I felt that it's good to have COVID once in a while. You can have a lot of food, take rest, watch movies. But then at the end of the third day it was with the unpredictable nature, I felt sad about it.
Thank you. I think Dr. Sulfikar has not given much time for the discussion. I find, so we'll go ahead straight.
Thank you, sir.
So I will invite Dr. Jayagopal PB. Rivaroxaban in other embolic disease. Have you found the Holy Grail?
Yeah, good evening everyone. It's nice to be back in the physical meetings, and a wonderful presentation, Dr. Deepak. I think hearing that, this will be a little mundane and boring topic, but I think the scientific committee has given something to think about, whether rivaroxaban is the only way to go about. So I think we are all fairly clear that in the last decade or so, rivaroxaban has made its presence right from the beginning with the venous thromboembolic episodes, whether it's the deep vein thrombosis or a pulmonary embolism. Of course, we go by the Einstein DVT, Einstein P, and so on and so forth, extended sort of therapies. Since then, we heard a lot about rivaroxaban in AF, and today I think it's almost like saying unethical if you don't write a NOAC in an AF patient. And right down the line, the big news is about the use in CAD. So I'm just going to discuss more on that because the topic of discussion is on atherothrombotic disease and where rivaroxaban have we found the holy grail. And from them, little more into the COVID coagulopathy, which you really heard about from, not about coagulopathy, about COVID so far, and then about the newer literature on bioprosthetic valves. So talking about coronary artery disease, I think we know that there are a lot of trials in the acute setting like the ATLAS trial and so on, which did not really push into it. And also that since then, I think people started focusing their interest more into the chronic coronary states. And then the concept that the dual antiplatelets worked, I think that's been one of the phenomenal achievements in the treatment of coronary artery disease. Way back when Antonio Colombo, after his stent implantation, showed that dual antiplatelet worked wonders. Then I think the focus shifted on to the acute coronary syndrome, and then as the post-PCI, and it's become the order of the day. Today we know that a dual antiplatelet is a way to go about, and something to target on the dual pathway approach, whether it's also on the thrombin, became an area of concern. And the concept was nothing new because people tried looking at the warfarin initially to reduce the thrombotic events, but found that this did not really succeed the way it was thought to be, basically because it produced more of bleeding events. So there was no real, I think the slides have gone off, there was no real way to really tackle this, and so for a while this did not really go on the way it was thought to be. I'm sorry for that. So subsequently, I think it's a COMPASS trial which we have all heard about. I'm not really going to dwell too much upon this because there's no point to talk to this august audience. But then just a brief this thing about 27,325 patients, low dose 2.5 milligram with 100 milligram compared to 5 milligram in aspirin showed a significant reduction in events, which is known to all of you sitting here. But then I think what I'm trying to drive here is possibly to dissect this COMPASS trial and to tell you that this was a study where this was prematurely terminated. The endpoints, they said they actually went with a pre-specified sort of a outcome which was tried, and they thought that this was achieved at the end of 1.9 years. This was terminated. This is one of the biggest flaws that one could ever talk of because this actually overestimates the effect of such a trial. So the primary outcome which came out, which actually led to the termination of trial, was a reduction in the MACE when they used the low dose rivaroxaban by about 24% and the net mortality benefit of 18%. I'll come to this concept of the net benefit a little later on because something interesting which has come up recently in the American Heart Association journal. The primary outcome was 24% lower, and the daily the combination of aspirin with rivaroxaban at 4.51% versus 5%. So if you look at the selected outcomes, whether it was, there were two arms, the peripheral arterial disease cohort or the overall COMPASS population. What you see in blue is with the 2.5 milligram, everything was significantly very effective, except that when you look at the bleeding points, there was definitely a slight increase in major bleeding points, which is not emphasized. Now, look at the outcomes of the PAD trials. Well, it was again compared to the placebo arm where rivaroxaban was and it's found to be very effective. And so trying to translate this in the peripheral arterial disease group and the CAD group into COMPASS is difficult because you have to understand that when aspirin alone was used in stable coronary artery disease, this led to a reduction of 20 to 30% events, but a slightly increased 1.4 to 1.6 increase in bleeding point. And today we all know that when you add an oral anticoagulant along with this would go off. I mean, the bleeding episode will go up. The COMPASS tried low dose rivaroxaban with aspirin. But I think one must confess that today we think aspirin is a villain mostly, and many people when they use an oral anticoagulant today would use a clopidogrel. The real world setting would be actually using clopidogrel along with rivaroxaban. We have only very limited data with ticagrelor, and not only that, a study from Japan, the AFFIRE study, which they showed when they tried the dual pathway. Surprisingly, we Indians, probably work like the Japanese population. There is an increase in the bleeding tendency in the dual pathway, and they felt that probably monotherapy with rivaroxaban is probably more beneficial in this group. So if you were to critically appraise, though we saw that for 24% reduction in events, the reduction of MACE is by about 1.3%, but then one must not disregard this 1.2 increase in major bleeding point which was seen. And again, another thing is that when they looked into the stroke, how did they look into stroke? It was just very low, only about 1,000 patients of this group really had a previous stroke. And when they really looked into this was just going by the clinical follow-up. There was no imaging or an MRI done to it, because one of the sub-studies where MRI was done shows you a different picture. And the major bleeding they observed was a GA bleed, not the kind of, that is what you see in your clinical practice. So is it right that you use every stable patient with a rivaroxaban aspirin compilation? That's where you come to the concept of a net clinical benefit, which is reported in one of the recent publications, JAHA, where you sort of look at the efficacy and then weigh it against the safety outcomes. No doubt, the low dose reduced bleeding events, but then there was a significant amount of bleeding events, but it was less effective in stroke prevention. And one of the important things, the high bleeding groups, which you really see in your real world setting, was excluded. And they categorically had younger patients. And why did they look at PAD? Because they wanted to really find out atherosclerosis in 2 vascular beds. And that was where the real benefit was shown. They called it the high risk group, but the high bleeding group was not there. And there was an earlier termination, which I alluded a little earlier on, which was not really, which probably overestimates this thing. So aspirin was thought to be the villain, and real world use in clopidogrel and newer agents are not really available. Let's look at it from the Indian perspective. There is something in the literature by Prabal Kalkar and the group where they look and they found that if the younger patients less than 65 years, there is a net clinical benefit. There is a good safety outcome with less of events, but the number needed to treat was 1 in 48. Whereas in more than 65 years, and that's what you see majority in your practice today, there is an excess bleeding. This is a real literature from India, how they try to dissect out. Now coming back to the non-valvular atrial fibrillation, I don't want to take you through these slides. Rocket AF, we all know about it. I just again want to critically apprise this trial and tell you that they showed a benefit. It was found to be non-inferior to oral anticoagulants. And again, the graphs are very, very, very significant. 1.7 versus 2.16 event rate, which is showing any non-inferiority to warfarin. But then again, there was the important message was that there was no significant difference in risk of major bleeding. But you look at that, look at what is clinically relevant in your day-to-day practice, hemoglobin drop, transfusion, it really didn't make a difference. So warfarin probably could have been as good. But then the intracranial bleed, actually if you go by the absolute numbers again, it's not very significant. And the message which was given is that intracranial fatal bleeding occurred less frequently. One must understand this group had a CHA2DS2-VASc score of 3.5, high sort of a CHA2DS2-VASc score. Definitely you need an anticoagulant. And one of the flaws which came out in 2014 when FDA analyzed, they actually looked at the PT-INR values with the device, and they found that this device is faulty in the majority of the centers. And what was the fault? They got a low INR. So there was a higher warfarin dosage increase, and there was an excess bleeding rate. So these were things which not came into, but then there was a counter argument saying that they look at the bleeding even in this study is 3.4. Look at any of the bleeding events in any of the trials with NOAC, it's close to that. So they said this is not, so it may not be really significant that died down. But then the fact remains that there was a flaw in the device which was recalled. So look at the group in Asians, what we call as the J-Rocket, the Japanese population. That's what is relevant from our perspective as well. And here, if you look at the Rocket trial, less than a creatinine more than 50, they used 20 milligram. Less than 15, it was 15. They brought down the dosage further. 10 milligram in less than 50 ml EGFR, 15 in the other group. And they found the Asian population this was as effective. And then the risk of major bleeding was less with a lower dosage. So perhaps this is what we need in our population. We really have to study the population. So coming to the triple world, the real world use in post PCI, Pioneer AF used 10 to 15, less bleeding, but similar thrombotic events. Redual PCI with DABI showed the same thing. And there has been a flaw saying that the triple versus the triple, when you use three agents, it has to be compared to a triple agent. Dual has to be compared to dual, and that was done in Augustus with the apixaban. And many people still feel that aspirin is a villain, so avoiding that would be the right answer. Well, there's been a lot of hype and news that this has been effective in bioprosthetic valves. You know, you have heard about it recently, non-inferior to warfarin. But then look at this COMPASS MRI sub-study, what I mentioned earlier. There were few stroke patients involved, and then they looked at the cognitive decline, looked at the MRI. They found that covert infects were not significantly reduced with rivaroxaban aspirin, but estimates for the combination of ischemic stroke and COVID were consistent with the effect on ischemic stroke. So I think they failed to look into this. So in the context of a TAVR and all that, this probably may not be beneficial. And today we know when you do a TAVR, you talk about the infarcts which come through the MRI. So I think these are all very, very relevant. And finally, I just wanted to present a scenario, nothing unusual, hypertensive, acute onset breathlessness, ANAF, fast ventricular rate, LV dysfunction, 25% EF, and that's what the EKG looked. But then when this patient came in, his platelet was 66,000. This is a real life scenario where you have an elevated liver function. Do we really use rivaroxaban here? And what does the literature show? When you look at that, the RAC recommendations on the child B or C, it is contraindicated. B, data is not available. So can we really use, we do not know. Again, this patient does not have a mechanical prosthetic valve or moderate cerebral syndrome is not contraindicated. But then bioprosthetic valve may be acceptable, but I think too early days to talk about. But finally, I think you need to think about what happens in renal dysfunction when the half-life gets prolonged when you use a DOAC. It's so much so with the rivaroxaban. And we clearly have this data, this is from the JAHA, which tells you that you must avoid if the creatinine clearance is less than 15. And in the context where it is less than 30, you need to be cautious. So there I think warfarin would really score. So in chronic kidney disease, to sum it up, less than 15 ml is contraindicated, less than 30 it's used with caution. In hemodialysis it's not used. Apixaban today has the best data, and I think warfarin still might be useful. I think many people do not realize in the Indian population, we also have many patients less than 60 kg. And the literature, when you look into less body weight, less than 60, they say avoid rivaroxaban. Same thing when you have a markedly morbid obese individual where you need to be used with caution. It may not have the desired effect. I think people have extrapolated this in the use of coagulopathy. I'm not really going to spend too much time, but it's only been compared to placebo, and there's been the Magellan, the Marinal trial, but not really tried with warfarin. In venous thromboembolism, cancer associated, people have been talking about it. But I think one area which has been overlooked is that, look, we don't really talk about drug interactions. We talk about drug interactions when you talk about warfarin. But I think amiodarone, renolysin, ticagrelor, verapamil, tolvaptan, you name it, all these have interactions. And the cost effectiveness, there is a lot of literature today saying that it's cost effective when you look into the prothrombin time. But I think in a country like India, we still have a long way to go. So again, bleeding tendencies, renal and hepatic has to be worried. I think one paper which is very relevant is the dosing. I think in India, I am sure people would definitely underdose. I think in the physician's perspective, this is a study where they compared and they found average about 72% to 80% are dosed properly. But then when you have a problem, there is a problem with underdosing or overdosing. And when you have an underdosing or overdosing, all the endpoints like the cardiovascular events or the bleeding, everything becomes markedly high. So I think it's very important to understand that when you use rivaroxaban, it has to be the right dose. So to conclude, I would say, we have the literature today to back up the usage of rivaroxaban. It is definitely non-inferior to warfarin. Offers less vascular protection, has safety profiles. It has a fast onset of action. You don't need to read a bridging with heparin or any of the agents. Improved clinical outcomes. And the fixed dose regimens, there is no need for any monitoring. You would say there is a simplicity of dosing. Improve the management. I think you can extrapolate its use in any of the valve situations. The COVID-19 coagulability, where it's become very important. But I think it's important to realize that it's contraindicated in chronic kidney disease, hepatic disease, or the liver, hemodialysis or liver disease, which I shown earlier. Extremes of body weight, which we tend to underestimate, and we really do not focus our attention. So I think it's important to realize, and I would leave you with this final message. This is a real world scenario from UK literature, risk and benefit of rivaroxaban versus warfarin. They actually captured this from a large number, more than 100,000 patient data. And what did they find? Overall, apixaban was found to be the safest drug with reduced risk of major intracranial gastrointestinal bleeding compared with warfarin. Rivaroxaban and low dose apixaban, however, were associated with increased risk of all-cause mortality compared with warfarin. And of course, the major villain is a GI bleed. So I think I would like to stop here saying whether the quest for the Holy Grail is over. I still feel it's not over. We still have a long way to go to find the ideal agent for a clinical practice. Thank you all for the kind attention.
Thank you, Jayagopal, for that balanced view of NOACs in atherosclerotic coronary and vascular heart disease. I too tend to agree that it is not everybody. It's not for everybody that we substitute one of the antiplatelet agents with the anticoagulant. I think we need studies in Indians, and probably we should start rivaroxaban only in those who are really at high risk. say like multiple risk factors, peripheral vascular disease, LV failure. It's not for everybody. Thank you.
Jayagopal, what about in diabetic patients? Because they have
Yeah,
told
there
that
is- yes,
diabetic.
Yeah, there is a subset on I didn't touch that. Compass diabetic subset. Well, it's found to be as effective. So the polyvascular disease. So the outcome is fairly the same. I think there's a analysis by Deepak Bhatt which has come recently. I think the REACH study also. There is another study there. So I think it's found to be effective as well.
Two comments from the audience. Johnny, do you use in chronic stable angina based upon the COMPASS trial? Do you use routinely in your practice? Along with aspirin, do you use warfarin, rivaroxaban 2.5 milligram twice daily? Have you started it, or will you start it?
Basically, I have not started personally. I think you can have
It.
yeah.
Mohan? Because I mean, the pharmaceutical companies are banking or hoping.
I think I'm in the process of starting it, because the only problem is you've been always telling you start DAPT, stop aspirin after 1 month or 1 week or 3 months, go to ticagrelor, and now you say at the end of 1 year go back to aspirin. And then it is a confusing picture, and they have found that in COMPASS again, the villain is aspirin. So we may have to find out a way by which aspirin is removed and substitute with either ticagrelor.
So you said you are thinking about
I mean,
it.
I have
So
already
how do
started
you,
it.
How are you thinking?
I mean, I have already started, because the concept of DAPT to DAPI looks exciting, and I think that is the best way to go in a chronic coronary syndrome.
Koshi, what is your opinion?
The reason is that, I mean, if we just analyze this particular trial, 60% of the patients in the COMPASS trial had a previous MI, number one. So actually they are a very high risk patients. So they had a better benefit. Number two, in the PAD patients, normally in the PAD also, there is a subclinical AF which occurs more than in 20% of the patients. So in PAD patients also, most likely, the benefit might have been because of the suppression of this AF and the embolic manifestation. So I think there is a hype in this particular.
But will you
sort of
use it in
No,
for
I will
patient
not-
with
I
the
will
prior MI and stable coronary heart disease?
No, I will not. I will not use
You
it
will not.
because I mean there is no ample evidence to support this
Okay.
one. If you go through all this one, now the webinars are on this particular trial. But
think,
I
sir-
don't think we can take the majority of the people in this audience to see whether there is whether we can use it or not. All we say that aspirin is not at all useful. Now you are saying aspirin should be there along with another sort of anticoagulant. I don't know. I don't think it is right.
Okay, thank
Sir,
you.
sir,
I think we'll wind up.
yeah.
We have to wind up. Already getting late. But it's a very interesting area. We can go on discussing. Thank you, Jagopal.
Thank you. Thanks to the speakers and the chairpersons. Before it turns into a scene from Asterix and the big fight, we will go on to the next session. Even though cocktails are not particularly my area of expertise, we have a session which is titled as Short and Sweet Cocktail. We have 3 sections: Smart Interventions, How Do I Do It? Drugs for the Heart, and finally data from the research desk. We invite the chairpersons, Dr. Sajan Narayanan, Dr. Saji Subramaniam, Dr. Ullas Mullamala, and Dr. Paul Thomas to take over. Thank you.
And despite being a weekend, it is happy to see that we have over 100 participants online and around 50 offline participants.
Good evening, respected seniors, colleagues, and my dear friends. First of all, let me thank Dr. ABC and Latin for calling me all the way from Calicut for this very important topic. and which is also the hot subject that is very recently discussed in our ICCK groups. It's the so-called balloon embedded stenting, even though internationally it is not called it by that name. I'll discuss very briefly in the next 5 minutes about the steps, pearls, and examples. Basically, the need for this topic is because provisional single stent strategy is always preferable to using 2 stents in most cases of bifurcations. This is because the less the metal, the better. And when we use one single stent, we should always think of protecting the side branch in the way that it should not be closed off or pinched with a significant myocardium supply. And while the pinching happens, there is an increased fluoro time against that is used, contrast that is used, additional stents or FKBA that may have to be used. So we need a technique to ensure a single stent strategy and at the same time minimize side branch loss. And thus we have to find a way for upfront protection of a significant side branch. The most common technique that was used till now was jail wire technique, though it was not at all useful to prevent side branch. It only serves as a roadmap. The first data came from Burzota et al. In 2010 when he mentioned about a jailed balloon protection. Here he just put a balloon across the side branch without dilating it. Then various upgrades came called the balloon stent kissing technique, then the jailed semi-inflated balloon technique where a side branch balloon was kept at 3 atmosphere to prevent over-dilation of the side branch ostium. Then recently the jailed Corsair technique came because the Corsair microcatheter was much easier to be removed across the stent and created less trauma when compared to the jailed balloon technique in few data. And then the modified jail balloon technique by Sato et al. Came where he defined the balloon size that was to be used and the inflation timing. However, the currently used technique is the modified BSKT, that is the balloon stent kissing technique, where the standard balloon stent dilatation technique is used and a routine pot should be done in all these cases. Then we have the largest publication from India, which is from Vinay Kumar sir, who has probably done the most cases of balloon embedded stenting. So coming to the step by step, first of all, I'll just say line by line so that it will be useful for the youngsters. Wire both the main branch and the side branch. Predilate the main branch. We can predilate the side branch only if necessary. Take the side branch balloon at 1:1 ratio. If you have a 1.5 side branch, 1.5, 2 or 2.5 for 2.5 side branches. Place it across the ostium with at least 2 mm protrusion into the main branch, which is well covering the ostium. The experts actually say that it is better to use half the balloon length compared to the main branch balloon. Anyway, it should protrude at least 2 mm into the main branch. The side branch is dilated to nominal pressures at 8 atmospheres. And then deploy the stent in the main branch at nominal. Again, the experts say that it is better to deploy in subnominal pressures because when we deploy a main branch stent at nominal pressure, it can actually overinflate the side branch ostium. So nominal or subnominal pressures as is preferred. Then deflate both simultaneously. Then remove the side branch balloon, do a check CAG, rewire the side branch, and then do a pot. Before removing the wire, you should remember to definitely go to nominal pressures for the main branch stent if you have deployed subnominally initially. So you should always complete with a pot, that is very important. So again, just a recap, you go with the side branch balloon and the stent, inflate them together and fully expand the main branch balloon after removing the balloon, and then rewire the side branch and then do the pot. You will get excellent results in most cases. Several bench testing has been done and there is enough and more data on balloon embedded stenting right now. OCT evaluation has also been done with excellent apposition details and side branch patency. Some pearls of wisdom after I've asked a few of my seniors is that you should always it's important to size the main branch balloon to 1:1. If you slightly undersize the main branch stent, it is likely that when you post dilate to a higher balloon, the initial advantage of the technique may be lost. So you can always use an imaging guidance if you are planning to do a balloon embedded stenting. So 1:1 should be the main branch stent, that is with the distal diameter. Beginners should always start with LED D1 bifurcations and last with LPDA bifurcations because of the multiple angles involved. It may be sometimes difficult to get the balloon out across the stent. Preferably use N balloons, and if it is preferable to deploy the main branch stents subnominally, even though most of the articles say deploy both of them, inflate both of them nominally, it is preferable to deploy the main branch stents subnominally initially. The concerns, yes, there is always the concerns of inability to retrieve the balloon, especially if the N balloons are not used. Side branch balloon rupture, dissection are all theoretical concerns. Main branch malapposition can happen, and there has been enough and more reports on stent deformation after the balloon embedded technique has been used in calcific lesions. Then there is always the question of calcification, what grade of calcification this can be done, the bifurcation angle. Even though there has been hundreds of cases done during the acute coronary syndrome scenario, thrombus burden is definitely a concern. You can actually push the thrombus more down into the side branch. Main vessel lesion length before the bifurcation is again something that has not been studied yet. And the side branch lesion length. If you have a long lesion in the side branch ostium, it is better to go for a 2-stent strategy than a balloon embedded technique because you can significantly dissect the side branch. I'll just present 2 cases very briefly. It's just a pictorial representation of 2 cases done by Vinay Kumar sir. One is a case of LED CTO. You can see that the LED CTO is recanalized. You can also see the LPDA, which has a bifurcation disease here and a significant side branch that is arising from it. This was done by standard technique of the modified balloon stent kissing technique, and you can see excellent results once the stent has been placed with an excellent side branch patency. The second case is a very unique one, and this was also an LED CTO ISR, and you can see that there were 2 branches that needed to be protected. One was the D1, which also had ostial lesion. The second was LCX, which did not have any lesion, but the stent had to be placed at the left, in front of the left main, just at the ostial LED. So he had to use the double balloon embedded technique, where 2 balloons were embedded, one inside the D1, which was 2.5 diameters, and the one inside the LCX, which was 3 mm diameter. And we can see how excellent the results were with excellent patency of both side branches. Thank you. So, the message that that could be said is that it's a very simple technique to prevent 2 stent placement as well as to prevent side branch loss. Thank you.
We'll go to the next talk. It's Drugs for the Heart, Selexipag, the new kid on the block, by Dr. Kiran Jacob.
Good evening, respected chairpersons, respected seniors, and my dear friends. We'll be discussing about Selexipag, the new kit for the management of pulmonary artery hypertension. It's basically an oral prostacyclin receptor agonist. Selexipag and its metabolites is, the mode of action is almost similar to the endogenous prostacyclins, but it's chemically different from the prostacyclins. This was the major phase 3 randomized control trial of Selexipag. That is the Griffon trial, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2015. It was a multicentric, double-blind, randomized, event-driven phase 3 trial. 1,156 patients were enrolled, which was randomly assigned to the 2 arms, the placebo and the Selexipag arm. And the patients in the Selexipag arm received the drug for a median of 70.7 weeks. The patients enrolled in the study was those patients with idiopathic pulmonary hypertension or hereditary pulmonary hypertension, or a pH associated with HIV, drugs, toxin, connective tissue, those patients with repaired congenital systemic to pulmonary shunt. And these patients either received the endothelin receptor antagonist or a phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor, or they were naive to any treatment for PH. And the drug was initiated at a dosage of 200 microgram twice daily. It was increased weekly dosage of 200 microgram, and a maximum dose allowed was 1600 microgram twice daily. The primary endpoints which was looked upon was the death, the complications of pulmonary arterial hypertension, the disease progression, and the worsening of PH. There were around 397 events, primary endpoints, of which 41.6% was in the placebo arm and 27% in the Selexipag arm. When you see the hazard ratio of the primary endpoints in the Selexipag group, it was around 0.6, and there was a significant p-value. So there was a 40% reduction in the primary endpoints, which was mainly the disease progression and the hospitalization, which accounted for 81.9% of the events. When you see the mortality, the death from any cause occurred around 105 patients in the placebo group, while it was 100 in the Selexipag arm. So there was no significant reduction in the mortality, but there was a reduction in the disease progression. When you see the 6-minute walk distance at week 26, there was a median decrease of 9 meters in the placebo arm, while it was increased by 4 meters in the Selexipag arm, which was statistically found to be significant. There was a significant reduction in the NT-proBNP in the Selexipag arm. The safety and the adverse events, the most frequent adverse events which was noted was headache, diarrhea, and nausea. 8 patients in the Selexipag arm was having a hyperthyroidism, was diagnosed with hyperthyroidism. There was no serious side effects which was reported. When you see this subgroup analysis, irrespective of their baseline pH therapy, whether they were on an endothelial receptor antagonist or a phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor, or a combination, or whether the patient was not on any therapy, all those subgroup are having a significant benefit with the Selexipag arm. Also, irrespective of their functional status, the WHO functional status, they were having a significant improvement. So, Selexipag was found to be very beneficial in this study. Now, we'll see what is for the pediatric population. This was a multicentric experience of the drug safety and efficacy in of Selexipag in PH patients in pediatric population, and this study shows that it was well tolerated and safe in pediatric population, and an add-on therapy of Selexipag improved the several outcome relevant variables in about 50% of the patients, and prevented the disease progression in additional 27% of the patients. This was another article which was stating Selexipag as a promising drug in the pediatric pulmonary arterial hypertension. When you see the ESC 2015 guidelines, they have given a class 1B indication for Selexipag in functional class 2 and functional class 3 category of patients. So the take-home message, it's an oral prostacyclin receptor agonist with the brand name of Uptravi by the Johnson & Johnson. The dosage ranges from 200 microgram to 1600 microgram twice daily. It can be used as a monotherapy or along with an endothelin receptor antagonist or a phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor. Griffon trial, the composite death and complication related to PH was reduced by 40%. There was a significant reduction in the disease progression, but no significant mortality reduction. It was safe, found to be safe and effective in pediatric population. It was a class 1B indication for PH in WHO function class 2 and 3 population. This is actually the only drug which acts through the prostacyclin pathway which is approved for the WHO functional class 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran. We'll have the discussion at the end. So we'll go to the next talk by Dr. Girish PV, DAPA-HF, my critical analysis and take-home points. I think two molecules which have taken over 2021, rivaroxaban and dapagliflozin.
Good evening all. It's a pleasure to be back on a physical meeting after a break, and no wonder we have a the talk of the town session here, and probably the talk of the town molecule is what I probably would be speaking upon. As discussed earlier, though it's not just the webinars, it's actually a lot of impact which has been really cast upon this molecule. And initially, even before we critically analyzed this, we used to feel that many of this could have been probably a part of a statistical analysis alone, because many mechanistic answers to the actual proposed mechanisms and the reality was not so evident initially with the use of this SGLT2 inhibitors. But now, with real growing evidence and the class effect of the molecule also being proven with other drugs also coming in and the trials coming in a serious fashion, now we have more clear answers on this. So there are a number of potential mechanisms by which SGLT2 inhibitors may protect against heart failure. Though most of it had been just potential mechanism, proposed mechanism, we now know that there is definitely a contribution to the preload and afterload reduction, the initial volume reduction that it confers, to start up with the change that the patient with heart failure can have, and improved myocardial energetics, initially thought of as a major mechanism, has probably gone down a bit with the evolution of this DAPA-HF trial, because that was more considered in diabetic heart failure, and now with DAPA-HF there is data that there is more for non-diabetics as well. But cardiac remodeling, improved cardiac contractility and protection against myocardial injury are the growing evidence that's coming up with this trial. So just going back to a story a bit before getting to the trial per se, the SGLT2 inhibition in the heart failure was probably a serendipity, because initially it was the preclinical stage of the disease that it was tried upon in diabetic population for prevention of heart failure. That was the CVOT trials showing overwhelming benefit with regard to heart failure benefit in cases of diabetes, and that was coming with the initial data from CANVAS, CREDENCE, the DECLARE-TIMI, EMPA-REG outcome, and so on. From there to clinical stage of the disease, now they have trial going on for myocardial infarction with dapagliflozin, and also the clear evidence has now evolved with regard to detectable cardiac involvement stage, that is in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. With regard, also there is trials going on for preserved ejection fraction, and DAPA-HF is the forerunner in that, because it is the first trial which showed that SGLT2 inhibitors in chronic heart failure with or without diabetes have a lot to say. So it is about 4,700 patients randomized into two arms, about 2,700 each, and the subgroup is above the age of 18 years, a significant heart failure. The average ejection fraction was about 31%, elevated NT-proBNP, eGFR up to 30 ml. So this was a trial which challenged the previous cutoff of 45 ml and brought down to more than 30 ml as a criteria. So they had renal disease, significant renal disease as well, stable on other treatment for heart failure patients. So it was an add-on on existing therapy. So it really represents the kind of population that we would normally be dealing with in our day-to-day population in an OP setting. The primary endpoints was a composite of cardiovascular death or heart failure, hospitalization or an urgent heart failure visit. Secondary endpoints being cardiovascular death or heart failure hospitalization, total first and recurrent heart failure hospitalization, cardiovascular death, improvement in the KCCQ score. The renal composite endpoints were also looked upon. And just look at the profile of patients a bit more. The patient's distribution was essentially more of males, 76%. The mean GFR of less than 60 was almost 40% of the cases had a mean GFR less than 60 ml even. And the NYHA class, generally the class 2 and class 3, very little of class 4 patients were not there much in this trial. And we had about 47% history of heart failure hospitalization for most of them. So it was a significantly diseased population, and see the data, dapagliflozin significantly reduced the relative risk of cardiovascular death or worsening heart failure on top of standard care. And it included about 10 to 15% of patients who are on ARNI also, the present gold standard that we would talk about. It's a number needed to treat of just 21, and that is a huge reduction, 26% reduction on this. And interestingly, if you cut down, you can actually see the benefit is probably slightly more robust with people who have had the last episode of heart failure in the last 12 months. Hospitalization. So once you had a hospitalization for heart failure, that's a clinically relevant finding, I felt, because when you have a patient who's had a decompensation and you recovered, now it's the time to probably introduce this molecule if you have not been on board, and that could be one game changer in our practice too. And benefit of dapagliflozin in cardiovascular death seemed to occur pretty early, and also for worsening heart failure opened at a much earlier phase, about 28th day. If you cut down the first 100 days, you could see that the benefit started appearing at 28th day. Probably initially, as we discussed, contributed by the reduction in the BNP and the diuretic effect to contribute the start, but the benefits persisted, and this trial was almost followed up for 18, 19 months and was stopped for overwhelming benefit. So trials which get stopped for overwhelming benefit, in fact, say that it's not safe to continue on the placebo arm. Again, speaks good for the molecule. Individual competence of the primary endpoint was significantly reduced with dapagliflozin. We know that about 30% is the number to remember for heart failure hospitalization. It is the only trial in gliflozins which have shown that there is secondary endpoint of all-cause death was also reduced. The cardiovascular mortality was shown better than that was shown with the Emperor reduced trial. So that was the difference between empagliflozin and DAPA-HF with regard to non-diabetic or population or the population of heart failure alone with or without diabetes. And the consistent efficacy in primary endpoints was seen with the trial. Both the curves look identical with or without diabetes. So it doesn't really come with the explanation of glucotoxicity or the glucose overload, the pre-existing uncontrolled diabetes as a major mechanism. So this trial actually provoked the thought process that this alone is not the mechanisms in heart failure improvement that was conferred and that was initially thought with these molecules, these gliflozins. And new onset diabetes as an add-on benefit in the trial was noted at about 30% reduction in the new onset of diabetes. So this molecule, kind of a diuretic in its essential, but also gives the add-on benefit that in the trial about 30% reduction in new onset diabetes. So this was also an overwhelming finding, a numerically fewer worsening of renal function events. So this trial did not have enough numbers of renal outcome reduction because probably the events were low, but essentially if you look at the numbers, though it was not statistically significant at that point, the p-value of interaction was 0.17 only, but the hazard ratio was 0.7. At least numerically there was a decrease in the renal endpoints. And in fact, the doubling of creatinine, which was noticed was a subarm, was definitely significantly reduced, 44% reduction. So what it does is probably revise our strategy of moving away from the horizontal, from the vertical approach of going upward, adding on drugs one of the other, rather than that probably introduce this molecule up front, the horizontal approach, try to bring all the molecules that we know have mortality benefit up front in a parallel fashion, and in a horizontal 3 to 4 visits you could probably bring all these drugs on board. And based on this, Vadaganath et al. And colleagues had proposed this DAPA-HF included with the paradigm, the data put together that if you have comprehensive therapy, which means ARNI plus beta blockers, mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, and SGLT2, probably would theoretically add 8 more years of survival versus conventional therapy, which is beta blocker, ACE inhibitor, ARB, without these molecules. So giving a very comprehensive therapy probably makes a meaning. This is one of the first trials which actually broadened those concepts of analysis. And looking at the EGFR, it was seen that even if the renal function was not great, less than 60 ml GFR also, you had heart failure benefits. The benefits were seen irrespective of EGFR status, and it significantly reduced the incidence of acute kidney injury by 44%, measured by the doubling of serum creatinine, though the renal individual endpoints did not meet statistical significance in this trial. So what we see in practice is definitely there is an initial small change in EGFR, but see the graphs, they actually show that after the 14th day or so to 700 days of analysis, you could see that there is improvement in renal function. And what we looked on in this trial, this being a newer trial, is that the benefit was it superior on top of existing ARNI, which was not studied so far with any other molecule. And ARNI being the gold standard again, though the number being small, about 12% of patients were on this drug, but you can see all the graphs where the chart shows clearly that the heart failure benefits were still persistent, whether the patient was on ARNI or not. So that was also an important additive point that we could find in the analysis of DAPA-HF trial. So has it changed the guideline a bit? Yes, the new guidelines do propose that the 2021 update to the 2017 American College of Cardiology Expert Consensus Decision Pathway now suggests that the addition of SGLT2 inhibitor as a class of therapy would be recommended for patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction and provides improvement in clinical outcomes and in patient-reported outcome measures. Achieve targeted or maximal tolerated dose of other drugs is probably not necessary before adding. This is a new line that has probably been added upon, and we as clinicians should try to achieve optimal GDMT within much shorter period, like 3 to 6 months of an initiation of a diagnosis rather than in a very prolonged course. And there was a proposed modification to the heart failure with reduced ejection fraction therapy algorithm following the results of DAPA-HF and Emperor Reduce, and that is this green column on the side. You could see where you have an addition of this drug at all levels of heart failure, probably right up front along with beta blockers. It's an option if patient is symptomatic despite beta blocker and ACE inhibitor. Also there, when mineralocorticoid receptors are considered, there also you could introduce this drug. And if patient is already on an ARNI, still the compounding effect and the adverse effects do not say that you need not use this drug. You can still add on at that level too. So that is the kind of proposed mechanism, that proposed suggestion that is coming up after the analysis of this trial. So I would just summarize here. Key take home would be, this is the latest approved heart failure molecule irrespective of the diabetic status. The renal outcome in the trial, DAPA-HF, was too small in number to really interpret as a significant change, but doubling of creatinine was almost 40% lesser in the small number of patients that the events were happening. And drug-proved efficacy on established regime of high compliance therapy with almost 90% ACE, ARB, beta blocker, and ARNI use and MRA use. It's such a significantly well-treated population, this drug could still hold the fort. So that is probably the consensus that we could probably derive upon, and this probably would be the talk of the town now. As you could see, this is the fourth pillar for the management of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Girish, for your comprehensive review. We'll now go to the the next talk on left bundle branch, left bundle pacing by Dr. Praveen Srikumar.
I think I'll touch upon the conduction system. I will broadly call it conduction system pacing, because this is something which is new, which we are practicing now, and this includes the his bundle system pacing and the left bundle system pacing. So I'll not just cover upon left bundle system, and mainly the issue, broadly speaking, it's a targeted system pacing, where we target the conduction system. So it is it's not a new concept. It was first described by Professor Jagat Nagarwala, who in 1970, who actually thought about this concept. He described the longitudinal dissociation of bundle system. That means that all the fibers destined to be in the ventricle, whatever electrical activation which is destined to be at the distal part of the muscle is already the conduction starts in the bundle of his. The preferential pathway starts in the bundle of his, very proximally, and that if you activate a part of the proximal bundle system, the preferential pathway from that point goes in serially up to a predestined portion of the ventricle. So that's the concept of longitudinal dissociation. And first clinical his bundle pacing was done by Deshmukh et al. In about 2000, but he did not use a particular sheath. What they used was the usual LV sheath that we use for CRT implant. So with that, they implanted the first left bundle speed and lead by his bundle's lead, and by screwing into the part of the proximal or distal his. So this was done, and he published a series of article, a case series, which showed that there is clinical improvement and very good QRS with reduction with this mode of pacing. Now we have dedicated sheets. In 2017, we have dedicated sheets which are available. This is called as a 315 sheath, which has a double curve. There is a first curve just like a LV lead sheath, and the second curve which is 90-degree angle to it. And the specific lead is a bipolar lead. This is from Medtronic. Now other vendors also have it. This is a bipolar lead. It's a screwing lead and has a proximal and distal pole which has a space of about 9 millimeter. And the scope is that it may prevent pacing-induced cardiomyopathy. That is all. In David trial, it was postulated that more than 40% of RV pacing-associated cardiomyopathy and heart failure hospitalization in patients with ICD implant, that is already being documented. And it's also an alternative to BiV pacing in heart failure with LBVV. Presently, for this indication, it has a class 2A indication. And in heart failure with narrow QRS and PR prolongation, because there's a better control of AV synchrony, manual control of AV synchrony with conduction system pacing. And in heart failure with narrow QRS, in AV node ablated patients, This has shown to produce good cardiac clinical improvement in heart function. And this is a lead and sheath which I described. Basically, this will be the anatomy of his bundle system. This is a hand-drawn picture. The thing is, what we plan to pace is at the distal bundle of his distal portion. The combat his portion is the where we want to get it. How do you reach this? I'll tell you. The thing is, first, distal most his part is the ideal pace of ideal site of pacing in the for the heart. And proximal left bundle is also a good place. It is similar to his, but it also corrects the distal his disease. Suppose the patient has an early proximal bundle disease. If you pace it just distal to this, it may correct that part of the bundle branch block also. Proximal left bundle, if you pace, that also corrects the proximal conduction system disease. And what we see is, if you do an accurate his pacing, you get a QRS which is exact similar to a normal physiological QRS. But if it's a left bundle pacing, you get an RBB pattern, a small r in V1, a very good Q2 LV activation time, a short LV activation time, which is measured from the onset of Q to the top of QRS or nadir of S. Usually, if you take V5, you take Q to on a peak of QRS. And steps are, usually we use the guide sheet with the lead to the area where there is a his potential. This is for his bundle pacing. So you can put a his catheter, you can use an EP system. Even without that, with a usual pacing system analyzer, you can do the procedure. So with the guide sheet and the lead, you can go to an area where you can get a his potential on the PSA. And then you do a unipolar mapping. That is, you connect one of the distal poles to the end of the lead and other to this other proximal pacing pole to the skin. So that's a unipolar. And you can do a unipolar mapping, keeping the lead tip just outside the sheet to get the EGM, and do a pacing from the distal tip. And this is done to avoid atrial capture. Mainly the intention of pacing is to avoid the atrial capture at the site where you have paced. So if you have an atrial capture, you have to move more distally to avoid inadvertent atrial capture. Otherwise, the huge problem is you will have atrial oversensing, and patients with CHB may not pace. So post-procedure, this will be an issue, and you have to revise the lead later. And then try to move most distally to the area where there's a good potential, and try to get the most minimum HV interval. So that is the aim, to try to get a good his potential and also a minimum most shortest HV interval. So this will be the thing. So you go to, this will be the approximate area. Upper is the atrial lead, lower is the his bundle lead. You can, this is an AP view, and on the left side is an LAO view. So earlier cases I had used to do with the mapping catheter, HD catheter, map the area of his and try to get to the most distal part of the his. You can, it can be done with specific mapping. But nowadays, mapping catheter is not required for all cases. So this is the area of his, here there is a his injury current. In that you can see that there is a his injury current. The injury current is exactly just after the his. It's like an ST depression. After the his, you can see a baseline deflection. And there are electrophysiological criteria for selective his bundle pacing to get a selective capture. But finally, what you look for is, a good his potential and selective capture. For example, this was a patient with the own rhythm, and this is the myocardial capture at 8 volt. You can see that there is a narrow QRS and a pseudo delta wave, which indicates some myocardial capture, and that when you reduce the voltage, you get a total narrow QRS, which is very similar to the original QRS. And left bundle branch block, as I told, the additional advantages, it may correct the proximal his bundle disease also. Here, this is the RAO30 view. You go in with the lead and the sheath about 1 inch below the his area. So you go directly to the ventricle. What I usually do is, you go with a wire, thermo wire into the ventricular apex, just like you do the routine pacemaker, pull back and go rotate slightly anti-clockwise so that you reach the anterior part of the bundle system is more anterior in the ventricle. So you move more anterior. So it around 11 o'clock position, just like you take a endomyocardial biopsy. In endomyocardial biopsy, you try to go more posterior, posteriorly on the septum. Here you go more anteriorly on the septum. As you draw out, go more anteriorly, and in RAO view, the catheter should face onto you. So you can see the en-face view of the tip of the catheter. And LAO40, at this position, you can check with an LAO40. LAO40, it will be around 2 to 3 o'clock position. That will be the approximate. This is because in LAO view, the septum will be like this. So almost slanted septum. So try to go as perpendicular as possible to the septum in LAO view. And then it's a screwing lead. You cannot use a screw to usual screw. It's a hand screwed lead. So you have to screw from the tip, just like you do an active screwing lead for LV. And suppose it's a native QRS. On high voltage spacing, you can get first you do a high voltage spacing, and then you come down the voltage. You get two thresholds. First threshold is where the myocardial capture changes, and it turns to a more selective narrow QRS. This is the area of selective capture. So there's a selective capture threshold, and when you come down again, you get the actual threshold of pacing. So there is a threshold for bundle system pacing and a threshold for actual capture pacing, myocardial capture. Yeah. So usually I do a pre-procedure echo to know the septal thickness. And for example, this is a pace conduction CHB patient, and post pacing, the QRS is very narrow and similar to the native QRS. So, and you can post procedure check the left bundle pacing. In left bundle pacing, we have done about, now it is not 25 cases, and we have done about 10 CRT cases. The main thing is that in left bundle pacing, you get a very good R wave than the his bundle pacing. The limitations for his bundle pacing is it may need more time. You have to spend more time. Need not always get a very good position. Need not always reach his. You may have to. We don't have that selective deflectable sheath now. If you have a deflectable sheath, most of the cases can be done, and your failure rates come down. And in left bundle pacing, the advantage is that it's more easy to perform. Presently at our center, what we do is we try all his bundle pacing. If the his bundle threshold is more than 2.5 at implant, you go to a left ventricle for left bundle pacing. And if there's a previous failure of his lead, you opt for a left bundle pacing. And if there are poor R waves, if the R wave is less than 5 at his, then you go for left bundle pacing. And if there is atrial oversensing, you move to left bundle. Left bundle pacing, one of the problem is sometimes you can't get to the ventricle if there is a tricuspid valve problem like tricuspid valve stenosis. In such cases, you prefer a his bundle pacing. And here there is better lead stability in left bundle pacing, and chance of procedural success is very high. And the R waves are usually excellent. So problems with left bundle pacing are, suppose RBBB, probably his bundle pacing is better than left bundle pacing, and post-septal myectomy, anterior infarctions with a scarred septum, tricuspid valve abnormality, and patients with post-VSD repair, or the septum will not be good for left bundle pacing. So how narrow we can get? Probably 40 milliseconds. Nowadays we get 60 to 70 with this system of pacing. Theoretically, probably you cannot go beyond much less than 40. So the ideal conduction system pacing would be on the septum. You try either his or left bundle, and also LV epicardium. Presently, the epicardial lead is directly onto the myocardium. Suppose we can get, theoretically, if we can get onto the conductions from epicardium also, that will be the narrowest QRS. So, but I don't know whether how we can achieve this. So conclusion is that left bundle pacing is easier than his bundle pacing, but we have less sensing, sensed R waves will be of less amplitude. So if you want a better R wave amplitude like in ICD, left bundle area will be a better choice. And both his and left bundle pacing has good lead stability and stable sense R waves. We have a data, we have joined with the original investigator also for LOT CRT study. And the follow-up data is very good. Lead stability is good over the past 2 years. So I think it's a future of pacing, and we are just awaiting data.
Thank you, Dr. Praveen. We'll go to the last talk of the session. It's a React 5. Is it a resurgence of Prasugrel? Dr. Harihara Subramania Sharma, who has missed the train from Trivandrum and came in a taxi.
Came in a taxi and again boarded a train. An adventurous journey.
Initially thank all organizers and especially Dr. Anil for giving me the opportunity to present here. As he told, it was an adventurous journey. So topic of discussion is mainly is ISA React 5 and Prasugrel, whether people have written of Prasugrel after plateau and the positive data of ticagrelor, but ISA React has given a breath of new life to Prasugrel. So Isar is a river in Munich. Actually, when I searched for this, I found that this has some connection also because this is mainly done in German center. Actually, out of the 23 centers who recruited patients for this, 21 are from German, and it is a German cardiac center initiative. So this was published in 2019 in NEGM, and in short, we'll just go through the trial, what it was. It was a investigator-initiated phase 4 multi-center randomized open-label trial, and 23 centers recruited patients, and most of them were German centers. Only 2 centers were from Italy. And the investigators proposed a null hypothesis that there is no difference between ticagrelor and prasugrel in ACS patients who are undergoing an intervention. Actually, to begin with, they thought that ticagrelor is superior, and the sample size and all were calculated thinking that the final result will be like ticagrelor will fare better than prasugrel. So these are the main inclusion and exclusion criteria. Most of them are same for most of the studies, except some of them we will highlight here. That is, they have excluded patients with history of stroke, TIA, or any intracranial hemorrhage. And another thing is active bleeding or clinical findings associated with increased risk of bleeding. That also, according to the investigator, if the patient is at an increased risk of bleeding, they are not included in the trial. And other risk factors like bleeding risk factors like HB less than 10, low platelet count, INR more than 1.5, they were also excluded. And this data cannot be extrapolated for patients on dialysis. They were also excluded. And any patient who comes with a cardiac event after a PCI within 30 days, what we call the acute to subacute stent thrombosis, that area, that patients were also excluded from this trial. So we may have some questions when the patient comes with stent thrombosis within 30 days, whether to switch from ticagrelor to prasugrel, which is better. If the patient was on clopidogrel, whether we should switch to some other drug. So this trial specifically has excluded those type of patients also. So here nearly 4,000 patients who were having ACS were randomized in an 1:1 proportion for ticagrelor and prasugrel, around 2,000 patients each. And out of that, 42% were having STEMI, and 46% were having NSTEMI, and around 12% were diagnosed to have unstable angina. So the study protocol was, you have a specific prasugrel protocol and ticagrelor protocol. Prasugrel protocol, as we know, we should give prasugrel loading only if we know the anatomy and we are planning for an intervention. So all the patients who were diagnosed to have ACS were giving loading dose of ticagrelor, 180 mg followed by 90 mg BD, and aspirin was 100 mg here. So in the plateau study, we know that 300 mg aspirin was used in most of the US patients. Around 50% of US recruitees were given 300 mg of aspirin, and we know the data what it shown. So here most of the patients, all of them received 100 mg aspirin in both prasugrel and ticagrelor arm. And in the prasugrel lemma, as we expect, if the patient is having STEMI, we give a loading dose of 60 mg as soon as possible. And if it is a NSTEMI UA, then we do the angiogram, and if procedure is planned, give loading dose on the table, which is called the prasugrel strategy. then followed by 10 mg dose. And in the previous Triton-TIMI, the 38 study, prasugrel has showed increased bleeding risk in a certain subset of patients. So here they have already included that as a protocol, and patients who were having less than 60 kg weight and more than 75 years, if included, were given regular loading dose, but follow-up dose is maintenance dose is only 5 mg per day. So they have taken all the precaution to prevent the extra bleeding from prasugrel. So patients who were recruited in these arms, most of them underwent a PCI, that is nearly 80%, 80 to 85% in both arms underwent PCI, and nearly 2% had CABG, and almost 14% were on medical follow-up in both the arms. So at the end of 1 year, the primary outcome was cumulative incidence of death, MI, and stroke. So we can see that the event occurred in 9.3% of the patients in ticagrelor arm and 6.9% in prasugrel arm. Before the study, they anticipated that the event rate will be around 10% with ticagrelor and around 12.5% with prasugrel. And their sample calculation was according to that. But at the end of the 1 year, they found that the event rate was almost half in prasugrel group than expected. They expected around 12.5, it was 6.9, and the p-value was very significant. I mean, it was less than 0.05. So if you take the secondary outcomes, that is the death, stroke, and definite stent thrombosis and MA as independent factors, there was no difference in the two arms in death, stroke, and definite stent thrombosis. But when you come to myocardial infarction, there was a 1.8% absolute risk reduction in prasugrel arm at the end of 1 year. And they have classified this MI, and type 1 MI, that is a spontaneous MI, and 4A and 4B, that is procedure related MI and acute stent thrombosis, were more in ticagrelor arm compared to prasugrel arm. And when you come to the safety point, BARC 3 to 5 bleeding was analyzed, and it showed no difference in the two arms. So when you critically analyze the study, there are some shortcomings. First of all, it is an open label design, and because they say that, well, others say that this open label design, that bias is somewhat mitigated because the outcomes were adjudicated in a blinded manner. And there was higher number of individuals who stopped the assigned therapy, that is around 15% in ticagrelor arm and 12% in prasugrel arm. And this they say that this may have overestimated the benefit of prasugrel. So if you stop...
Sorry to interrupt, can we make it faster?
Yes, sure. So greater than 80% of the individual have underwent PCI, limiting the extrapolation of these results to patients who are managed conservatively. So most of the patients who are undergoing PCI can only be extrapolated from this study. And another thing is, most of the follow-ups, around 90%, were telephonic follow-ups, not clinical follow-ups. And 19% of patients were not receiving the trial drug at the discharge. So when you analyze the data, it shows that some people have stopped the drug because of physician preference, and some because the patient did not tolerate, and some because the patient had atrial fibrillation and they had to be started on an anticoagulation. So these two drugs cannot be given with an anticoagulation as of now. So around 90% of the patients were not on the trial drug at the time of discharge. And when you compare the safety outcome, number of patients excluded from the safety analysis were 10 times more in the prasugrel arm. So here the authors say that because most of the patients who were randomized to the prasugrel arm did not undergo PCI, some had to be shifted for medical management, and some were not undergoing procedure. The safety data, more people were excluded from the prasugrel arm. That is the explanation given by the authors. and they have excluded patients with acute stent thrombosis. So the question whether this prasugrel or ticagrelor is better in a stent thrombus situation cannot be answered. So why ticagrelor failed in this trial? Some of the findings are it is having a short half-life, so reversible inhibition, making the increased, it makes the cost of the missed dose very high because it is short acting, and even if you 1 or 2 doses are missed, risk of MI is high. And dyspnea and other adverse events made many patients discontinue the ticagrelor than prasugrel. And careful patient selection and reduced dosing in vulnerable population reduced the prasugrel related bleeding, thereby giving an advantage for prasugrel. So after reading this, my algorithm is like, if the patient is having ACS, if the patient is having a stroke, history of TAA, or you are planning for a medical management, then go for ticagrelor. And if the answer is no, then prefer prasugrel, and give reduced dose to less than 60 kg patient and more than 75 years. And take home message is prasugrel strategy, that is loading after knowing the anatomy, doesn't carry any higher risk, and prasugrel is more tolerated than ticagrelor, and in appropriately selected patients, prasugrel is superior to ticagrelor if you are planning an invasive strategy. But as the patient population is, most of them are Germans and only 2 Italian centers, it is not a wide variety of patient population studied, so we require further data to substantiate the finding. And finally, the answer to the first question, yes, definitely ISAR React gives a new breath of life to prasugrel, but most important thing is patient selection, to whom you are giving. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hari, for that excellent talk. As we are running short of time, we will avoid discussion. Thank you so much, speakers and chairpersons. After that action-packed, high emotional quotient talk on COVID by Dr. Deepak, we all agree to it that COVID is a matter which is worth discussing, and we have a session on cardiovascular issues in the time of COVID. It's a case-based discussion titled COVID Heart of the Matter. For this, we have chairpersons Dr. Jabir Abdullah Kuti, Dr. Manu R. Verma, Dr. K.U. Nadarajan, and Dr. Sibu Matthew. The first case will be presented by Dr. Varun.
I have an instruction from Dr. Anil that there is no blah blah, so we are going straight to the cases. The case one, it's going to be presented by Dr. Varun, who is interventional cardiologist at Medical Trust Hospital, Kochi. Varun.
Thank you, sir. Very good evening to everyone. So as sir said, I will just be presenting the case very short, just to kick off a discussion and just to be the like a germ for discussion. I'm sure everyone has their own unique experience with COVID and has seen unique presentations, and COVID has been very challenging. It throws up a lot of conundrums, especially in deciding which is the best treatment option. So this patient actually came as a 48-year-old male, no previous comorbidities. He had a history of asymptomatic COVID infection 3 weeks before he presented to us, and he came with a history of fever and loose stools for 3 days, generalized tiredness, decreased urine output, and on presentation he was found to be tachycardic with cold, clammy extremities, low pulse volume, and he was hypertensive. So the clinical diagnosis was cardiogenic shock. These are just some of the labs, just to give you an idea. His D-dimer was elevated, procal was elevated, CRP was elevated, and NT-proBNP was quite high. So he was admitted, started on inotropes, and he was found to have echo showing severe LV dysfunction with global LV hypokinesia, suggestive of COVID myocarditis. And he had severe renal failure with metabolic acidosis, so he had to be started on a slow, low efficiency dialysis. So for which a right jugular catheter was placed, and he was also started on prophylactic dose of heparin for DVT prevention. So 3 days later, as he was slowly improving, echo was done just to check for the status of the LV, and that threw up the surprise. There was a, if you can see closely, there is some structure in the right atrium, and it looked like some kind of a thrombus or something sitting there. So we did a transesophageal echo, and that showed this picture. So you can see in the bicable view, there is a bunch of grapes, and that is located exactly at the tip of the IJV catheter. And this was measuring around 13 to 14 mm, and it was highly mobile. So this gave us a big surprise, because we were not expecting this finding. It was incidentally detected. Patient otherwise was clinically improving. So now I'll just put the question to the panel and the experts. What do you think should be the best treatment option in this situation? So would you just give a full therapeutic anticoagulation because patient is improving and clinically stable, or because of the risk of deterioration in this patient who has a borderline hemodynamics, would you opt for doing some kind of a either a surgery or an intervention, or would you opt for a thrombolysis? So these kind of situations, we don't have any guidelines to guide us. These are individual, unique cases, and everyone's opinion might differ. So I would like to open the question to panel and
question to us. Examination. Okay. So I will go for a full anticoagulation, full dose anticoagulation now. Surgery at in this patient who is improving without any evidence of embolization, to remove that in a COVID positive patient with all these all these problems. Surgery is definitely now out of question. Then thrombolytic therapy, okay, you can lyse it and then may embolize at a distant part. At present, there is no evidence of pulmonary embolism, just a thrombus at the tip of the catheter. So I'll go for a good full dose of heparinization. That will be my approach at this level.
I quite agree with it. We have discussed this case in the past. I would go for the same.
Yeah. So the other consideration that we were having was that
small question. He said being COVID positive. This patient had an asymptomatic COVID infection 3 weeks prior. So which means the current RT-PCR is negative. He was antibody positive.
I thought I think I missed it. I thought it is a COVID positive. No, okay.
Post-COVID. No. So he had already recovered.
Or even in post-COVID patient in this scenario, surgery is going to be difficult.
So we actually considered whether we should do some kind of intervention, but then because we were not sure how to approach it, when obviously we're trying to remove the catheter, the clot might embolize. While trying to grab the clot also, it might embolize.
Did you do a re-RT-PCR?
Yeah, re-RT-PCR was done. It was negative.
Okay.
There was no reinfection. And surgery was out of the question, and but we felt that something had to be done more than full therapeutic dose, because by the time it takes for the clot to resolve, there might be some pulmonary embolism which might worsen his hemodynamics. As he was recovering, we didn't want him to deteriorate, so we chose to actually thrombolyze him. So we actually gave IV retiplase, and after retiplase, the patient actually made a very quick recovery. His clot dissolved very fast, and repeat echo showed the resolution. On doing a small literature search, I found a similar case in reported, where they actually attempted aspiration with a device called AngioVac, which is a very large 14 French lumen catheter device, and using a mechanical suction they aspirated the clot. But during the case, actually the clot did embolize to the pulmonary arteries, caused acute deterioration. They had to put the patient on a RV Impella, and the patient was in Impella for 48 hours and took a longer time to recover. So these kind of cases are fraught with risk if we try for doing some intervention. Luckily, this patient got away without much deterioration, and we were successful. He came off dialysis, creatinine improved, we were able to remove the catheter, he had no complications. LV function also improved. No. Probably, but we didn't use IVIG. The patient actually recovered just with.
Nothing specific was done for the LV dysfunction.
No. Only by giving the dialysis as well as the inotropic support. Over a period of within 4 or 5 days, he improved. In fact, the reason for thrombolysis is only one thing. People have given. I had done the literature search. People have anticoagulated and waited during this time. Many patients had thromboembolism. So we thought anyway, if it is embolized, let us lyse it and see. So we lysed it and then we anticoagulated the patient. Then within 3 days the whole thing settled.
No, you are right, because anticoagulation will only prevent further clot formation. What is already formed has to naturally lyse, or you have to lyse with the pharmacotherapy. So the idea of giving anticoagulation is to prevent further buildup of clot and wait for the natural thrombolysis of the clot. Wishful thinking, and that most of the time works also.
But that is the major treatment in a
That I will go for that approach, because thrombolysis has got its own risks also. So this is not a big clot. I will. No, yes, yes, it is.
13 to 15 millimeter clot. You think about the 13 to 15 millimeter clot getting embolized?
Now,
Yes.
both therapies, I think both Subbu as well as Manu both have their own points, because we cannot say who is right or who is wrong.
No,
in this
one more
situation.
thing is that there is a literature though, doing surgery and removal of the clot also. The people have done that also, surgical evacuation also.
But this particular situation,
In the same situation, a 7-year-old boy.
in the post-COVID scenario.
In the post-COVID scenario, they had done the surgery and removed the clot.
Oh, okay, but these are all anecdotal reports, only
Absolutely.
case
Case
reports. It
reports,
is all the
witness
wisdom and the analysis and the clinicians take call on this.
Luckily, we don't have any series. to talk
Right,
about.
a particular person. So this is all the based on the previous experience, the literature search, and then I think a consensus opinion by discussion with whoever is involved in the or the attending physicians. We cannot make any firm recommendations. Thank you. Fantastic case.
No, he did not have.
No, this was the only problem. May I call upon Dr. Dire? He is our DNB resident. He is going to present another case, same 3 weeks after the COVID.
Good evening, everyone. I am presenting a case entitled Catch Me If You Can. Patient is a 53-year-old gentleman. He was a diagnosed case of polycythemia vera with JAK2 mutation positive and low erythropoietin level. He was also diagnosed to have systemic hypertension 8 years back, and during evaluation he was found to have bilateral renal artery stenosis, for which bilateral renal artery stenosis stenting was done in 2014. He had restenosis and POBA was done to the right renal artery. Along with that, he had renal dysfunction. EGFR was 65 ml per minute. Then in January 2019, he had an STEMI. They opted for medical management in view of the renal dysfunction. Then in September 2020, he presented with heart failure. He was in class 2 and he was started on medical therapy. He was being planned for coronary angiogram, but prior to admission, he had COVID infection. It was an asymptomatic infection. So we postponed the angiogram to 3 weeks, following which he was readmitted, but his dyspnea had worsened post the COVID infection from class 2 to class 3. He did not have any other cardiac symptoms. On examination, pulse was 60 per minute regular, all peripheral pulses were well felt, BP was on the higher side. CVS, no significant findings except for LVS3. And CNS was there was no neurological deficit in the nervous system. ECG saw sinus bradycardia with T inversions in lateral leads and LVH. Echo showed moderate LV dysfunction with global LV hypokinesia, and there was the inferior and infroseptum was scarred. Though even though he was polycythemic patient, HB was not so high, it was around 16.8. He used to undergo intermittent phlebotomy. Creatinine was 1.7, and on admission, NT-proBNP was 12,000. Angiogram was done to the right radial artery. LAD is type 3 with proximal having some 30 to 40% stenosis, astride the septal branch. Second, ostium of the second diagonal had around 80% stenosis. And the third diagonal had a small thrombus in the proximal segment. The RCA, it has an aberrant origin from the left coronary sinus, dominant system, and mid to distal, it has a diffuse disease, doubtful of dissection, and distally there was some thrombus. Since the vessel was not suitable for stenting, we planned to continue conservative management. Post CAG, he was shifted back to radial launch. Then within 30 minutes, he had sudden onset of the left upper limb and left lower limb with slurring of speech and facial deviation to the right, mainly involving the right MCA territory. Power was grade 1/5 of the left upper limb and lower limb. CT brain was taken. There was no infarct or bleed. But within 2 hours, power improved to grade 4/5. During that time, he developed sudden chest pain. All this while, he was hemodynamically stable. We took an ECG. ECG showed ST elevation of the inferior leads, 2-3 AVF and ST depression of 1 AVL and V2, V3. So we took him up again for reangiogram. Here we see that when we compare, this is the first angio, this is the second angio. So when we compare to the first angio, the thrombus was actually dislodged to distally. So again, we decided to just continue with conservative management. We also took a DSA, but there was no significant finding in the DSA. After that, we shifted back to him. Then he again developed complete weakness of the left upper limb and lower limb. Hence, we decided to thrombolize after consulting the neurologist. He was thrombolized with tenecteplase with 40 mg. It was uneventful, and ECG showed good ST resolution. But that is not the end of the story. Again, the next day, he complained pain in the right hand. It was cold with bluish discoloration compared to the left hand. SpO2 of the index finger was 83% and the thumb was 77%. We took an arterial Doppler of the right upper limb. It showed thrombus involving the right radial artery at the level of wrist and forearm. Also, there was thrombus involving the cephalic vein. So we continued him on low molecular weight heparin. Gradually, the right hand pain decreased, and however, there was some residual lesion with fingertip discoloration, suggestive of digit ischemia. The weakness of the left upper limb and lower limb completely recovered, and there was no further chest pain. And he was discharged with the following medicines. We started him on rivaroxaban 15 mg and ticagrelor 90 mg BD. See, he was already on aspirin and clopidogrel, but he had the thrombosis, so we thought of giving a more potent antiplatelet, so he was started on ticagrelor. And other heart failure medicines and CAD drugs were initiated. On follow-up, he continued to have LV dysfunction. He had dyspnea on exertion class 2, and the discoloration had slightly progressed. There was digital ischemia along with pseudoaneurysm of the right radial artery. We thought of giving a conservative management by applying pressure, but that did not improve. So he is being planned for surgical repair. So here we are dealing a case of thrombosis involving multiple vascular bed, involving the coronary artery, cerebral artery, peripheral artery, and even the venous system. So basically, he had a prothrombotic state, polycythemia, which itself is a prothrombotic state, following which he had a COVID infection, which would have accentuated all this thing and had leading to multiple thrombotic lesions in various vascular beds. Thank you.
So what do you think is the reason for all this hypercoagulable state? Wherever you touch, he is developing thrombosis. Cubital vein, radial artery, coronary artery, and even embolism to the brain. So what do you think is the problem here?
So probably the polycythemia with COVID infection that could have precipitated all this.
What is the D-dimer? Did you say that?
D-dimer.
STEMIs, and so far I think I collected data close to about 90-95 patients. 30 patients were highly positive for the COVID antibodies, and some of them have really huge thrombus actually in the coronary arteries when they come with the STEMI. And one case was really mind-boggling. He had a huge thrombus in the left main going all over the LED, And so since I'm a fan of the intracoronary lytics, I did that. But just like you had, this guy also had thrombus in the, he developed a hemianopia, had the thrombus there, thrombus everywhere. And funny enough, all these young patients, I've also been looking into other hematological parameters. Some of them have hyperhomocystinemia. And that actually in this guy contributed to the huge thrombus burden. So I think the COVID-19 scenario itself is a really prothrombotic state. And so some of these things are really, really eye-openers to other.
One added to the other.
Yeah,
Homocystinemia
so this
added
kind of
to
category, the polycythemia plus the COVID, which is responsible. So I think these are real eye-openers. We should look for other hypercoagulable states.
This person was initially worked up extensively because he had a problem at a very younger age group. At 2004, he had the first myocardial infarction, and he was some 36 or 38 years at that time. I don't exactly remember the name, but he was extensively worked up. He had nephro issues, renal stenting, renal stent restenosis. Then a POBA was done to the renal stent. So a lot of issues he had.
And just a comment, I don't agree with the ranolazine prescription of post-MI scenario. Ranolazine prescription.
All right.
It can create a lot of debate for
No,
that.
it is not a post-MI scenario. This person has been taking
elevation MI.
He has been taking ranolazine for long.
For effort angina.
For effort angina.
Okay, this is a hypercoagulable situation where polycythemia and post-COVID situation. So we should be more careful in doing probably intervention in such patients, and we should work up for hypercoagulable situations also in such situations. And you have to expect.
In fact, this person, I have asked an angiogram some 2-3 years ago when he had ACS. At that time, they were not willing because of the renal issue. Of late, when he had heart failure, they wanted to find out, is there any way we can get out of this situation? So I suggested again, we'll have an angiogram and see whether there is a revascularizable area. And I posted for angiogram. Then he developed a COVID. But I waited for only 3 weeks. I should have waited for more. At that time, I was also not much aware of this procoagulant state in the post-COVID scenario after 3 weeks. Had I known that, I would have waited.
For general surgeries.
But learned with a, with burning of our fingers.
For general surgery, there is a guideline for anesthesiology because my wife is an anesthetist.
6 weeks.
She shares it. 4 weeks for asymptomatic patients not hospitalized. 6 to 8 weeks for asymptomatic patient hospitalized. Around 10 weeks for symptomatic patients hospitalized with mild problems. 12 weeks for sick patients. 6, 8, 10,
this
12.
person was asymptomatic.
This is all elective procedures you try to do, postpone at least these days, at least.
Right.
All elective procedures.
What was the neuroimaging finding in your case?
The neuroimaging finding, we could not find any neuroimaging because we did a CT quite early. There was no bleed. There was no ischemic area also because we did it in 1 hour. Because our idea was to discuss with the neurologist whether we need a neuro intervention or a thrombolysis. But then at that time, patient improved. There was no finding. So we didn't do anything.
One small word of caution with this combination of the full dose rivaroxaban and ticagrelor. Most of the AF trials, the so-called the switch to anticoagulation, the Augustus trial, the redual PCI, and the Pioneer AF trial with rivaroxaban. I think one of the speakers during the course of today's deliberations also mentioned more than 95% of the patients actually were on clopidogrel, only few were on ticagrelor and none were on prasugrel. Close to none were on prasugrel. So that just because clopidogrel did not work in the first place, going to this combination sometimes can be counterproductive. You can scale down the antiplatelet when you give a directly acting oral anticoagulant.
It was what to do. We also were not sure which therapeutic agent we should select. 10%.
10% were on ticagrelor.
But these are all separate. These are all different scenarios. This is a scenario where this person had a stroke, a prothrombotic state where we need an anticoagulant definitely. Then which antiplatelet agent? This person has been on aspirin and clopidogrel. Despite being on aspirin and clopidogrel, he developed this problem. So we thought it is better to go for a potent agent. And we were afraid of putting aspirin again. So we omitted the aspirin, put on rivaroxaban.
No, you are correct. Both the American as well as the European perspective in this AF with PCI very clearly say that if the ischemic risk is far more than the bleeding risk, you can consider using ticagrelor in addition to one of the DOACs.
Here it is the ischemic risk because, and on the top of that he had polycythemia also. I understand. And then when we gave this thing, he developed a pseudoaneurysm, and I'm going to send the patient. Now it is 3 months past, we are going for surgery because it's a huge pseudoaneurysm. I'm afraid it may rupture. Are not interested in tenecteplase. They don't give tenecteplase. Our neurologists will give alteplase, the full dose of alteplase they are giving. Most likely, but at the same time, he developed a radial artery embolic thrombus also.
Very challenging case with lot of more than diagnostic dilemma, therapeutic dilemma, and you have managed it well in the absence of guidelines to guide you. That is very, very commendable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thanks to all the discussants and chairpersons.
Thank you.
We now come to the end of the scientific program.